Welcome to the Athletic FC podcast with me, Akinwolere. Manchester City have had a disappointing season compared to their usual high standards. But the summer window offers Pep Guardiola the chance to rebuild. So which players are they targeting? And will it be enough for them to be Premier League contenders once again? Right, with us today, we have the Athletics Manchester City correspondent Sam Lee, and we've also got Phil Hay as well. Right, Sam, we'll get into the summer window super shortly, but, this, I guess, it is a bit of a rebuild, and City have been at it, really, if you think about it, since January. Let's not forget they spent around £183 million on new additions. I mean, did they need them, considering that actually there's some youth prospects popping through, and actually they had an okay team at that moment?
Well, I mean, on paper they had an okay team, but in reality it wasn't working, was it? We did so many podcasts around December, January time, just on how badly they were doing. It became obvious they needed a rebuild. And look, City, I think at the start of December they didn't plan to bring in so many players in January. They just wanted a box-to-box midfielder, but then things kept getting worse on the pitch, performances, injuries, and they're like, okay, we need to do something now. We need to move the budgets around, spend some money in January. But again, in terms of like, did they need that? Yeah, they did. But did they get it? Not really. Like they brought in two centre-backs. I think the ages have obviously changed since, but basically Vitor Reis was like 18, 19, got him from Brazil. He hasn't started a Premier League game, and the plan was never for him to do that. So they still bought him for the future. Kusanov, who played kind of a bit at the start, obviously memorably against Chelsea, really terrible debut, but very solid since then. But since the last 5 weeks, when they've got back to winning ways, he's not played at all. Nico Gonzalez was like the great Rodri replacement hope. Not played at all, really. And I mean, he's played more than Kusanov in these last 5 weeks, but he's not been a staple of it at all. And then there's Marmoush, who has added a bit for sure. Yeah. But it's like, yeah, they did need to start that rebuild then. They needed new blood. They needed new energy. But it's not like they filled the team with 4 players who were like, right, you two are starting, you're starting there, you're starting there. They've kind of been, apart from Marmoush, they've kind of been peripheral, really. But that's because as much as they needed something in January, they were still not panicking. They were still kind of thinking long term. Kusanov is not for now. Hayes is not for now. And even Nico Gonzalez, it turns out, is not for now. So, yeah, they definitely needed something, but it's not like they got exactly what they needed all at once, because this road to recovery recently has been all about the older players who everyone wants to get rid of.
Yeah, that's the one, Phil. And, I mean, look, Sam's right. Marmoush really is probably the most eye-catching out of all those signings. Just, I think, simply because we haven't seen probably enough of them. What do you make of the new additions in January that came to City? I don't know if you could say they've added more to this team, but Marmoush, for sure, attacking-wise, has offered them something a little different.
Yeah, I was sat with Tom Harris at the FA Cup semi-final against Nottingham Forest at Wembley. I was sat with Sam as well, but I happened to be on a desk with Tom. And, Tom knows his onions. And at one point he said to me, if City were signing Marmoush now, as opposed to in January, he'd probably cost twice as much. And perhaps that's a slight exaggeration, but I think broadly it's a pretty fair assessment as well. He has the makings of a really good catch, and I feel like he's settled in well at City. He gives him a slightly different feel up front, I would say, as well, in comparison to Haaland, which isn't to say that they're better off with him up front rather than Haaland. But it's pretty obvious to me anyway that he's a bit more of a creative mind and certainly not just a goal scorer. Kusanov, time will tell. He needs to acclimatise fully, and I don't see them losing out actually on the money they've spent on him. What was it, like 30 to 35 million? I think he's definitely got something about him and is a Pep type of centre-back. Victor Hayes, seen very little of, so hard to judge. Nico Gonzalez, I have watched previously and I do like, and I think he will be money well spent. But Sam is probably right. It hasn't addressed everything and hasn't fixed them to a huge degree. But without going the whole hog, I think what January did do was start to address the various areas of the squad that needed work. They got a bit caught out, did City. The squad almost went over the hill more quickly or more suddenly than Guardiola anticipated. That's safe to say. But I suppose what they have done is they've used January to avoid the need to do a ridiculously vast amount of recruitment and spending in the summer. They're still going to have to spend and they're still going to have to recruit, but they've almost split the workload between January and the close season that's coming up, which might almost mean that some of the outlay is, falls between different accounting periods. And without wanting to bore people about that, that is kind of important too.
Yeah, for sure. We'll go into who potentially might be coming in later on in the pod. But Sam, I'm just looking after that defeat to Forest in the league in March, I think March the 8th. City have gone unbeaten in the league and comfortably look like they've turned around their fortunes, and we'll talk about the importance of potential Champions League football next season, but not just the signings necessarily, as we've just mentioned, but what else has Guardiola tweaked? What else has he added to his team that we probably haven't seen before? Because this isn't the same Man City that we're used to, as we know.
Well, no, not in some respects, not in a lot of respects. But that's the thing about the impact of the January signings. There was that kind of middle period from like start of February until that international break. So after that Forest game you mentioned, it is part of the unbeaten run, but they drew 2-2 with Brighton, and it wasn't a good performance really. Brighton were really good. They had a massive chance to win it at the end. And to kind of contrast it to the start of February time, it was like, or even the end of February, they lost against Liverpool 2-0. And like myself watching it, and like a lot of City fans that I speak to and talk to and whatever, were like, well, it wasn't that bad. Like I thought, I said at the time that wasn't in the top 10 defeats that City had, which is mad. Normally City wouldn't have 10 defeats, let alone like a hierarchy of like how bad they were. Losing only 2-0 to Liverpool was like, okay, this is all right. Then they beat Spurs, and it was like, this is a bit more stable. And that was then, okay, Kuznetsov was playing, looking quite good. Nico Gonzalez was playing. He played really well in a 4-0 win against Newcastle. And it was like, okay, there's green shoots of recovery here. Marmoush should come in. He'd scored 3 against Newcastle. And it was, okay, this is okay. Then it kind of started to tail off a bit with Forest and the Brighton game. You think, actually, I'm not really sure where they are. So then what changed really was the Bournemouth away game in the FA Cup, which was after the international break. And Guardiola and the staff looked at the game against Bournemouth in November when City had lost, which was the first Premier League defeat, the second defeat of the bad run. And he said, look, in terms of duels, in terms of all this stuff, we just weren't at it. We cannot play like this. And that was kind of his team talk for the game in March. But the players he chose to do it, like I alluded to before, were all the players who've had like the hardest seasons. De Bruyne, Kovacic, Gundogan, Bernardo, played them all. And then I know not long after that, a week after that, they played the Manchester Derby. Played Foden in there as well, and Foden struggled. It's just basically, it's everybody in the middle of the pitch. And as the weeks have gone on, it's been easier to kind of put like a formation to it, like explain it. It's basically a 4-2-2-2. So to answer the question of why things have been better recently, and to kind of show that it's not so much the January, February signings who did add a bit of, green shoot stability for a while. This has basically been done without them. Nico Gonzalez hasn't played that much. It's been Gundogan and Kovacic, the most maligned players from that December period where they were leaving so much space, they couldn't cover the ground, counter-attacks against them so easily. Bernardo running to the ground. Guardiola described him as like empty, like physically and mentally empty in that period. De Bruyne has obviously got to the stage where he's not been playing well. The club have decided not to renew his contract. And yet they're all having this kind of resurgence because they're not leaving spaces in the middle because there's so many of them in that area. Phil, you would have seen it at Wembley. By the time they played Forest the other week, it was just like, okay, this is like a perfectly formed 4-2-2-2. So at the bottom of it, you've got Kovacic and Bernardo, who were just managing that game very, very well. Ahead of them, it was like Grealish and Rico Lewis, who would, in theory, be the strikers, but they weren't even false nines. They weren't starting high up and dropping off. They were just in that kind of midfield area. But this is where it's interesting to describe because they had 2 wingers. They had Marmoush and Savinho, but they were playing inside because the fullbacks were high and wide. So you got like 3 stacks of 2 playing through the middle. And the wingers are kind of the strikers because they make runs behind, but the Forest defenders had nobody to mark. You could call Grealish and Rico Lewis false nines, but they weren't. They were more like, they were like deeper than the wingers were. But they weren't so deep that they were where Kovacic and Bernardo were. And it's just this kind of beautiful harmony of having so many players in the middle that Pep has always wanted. So again, to go back about 18 minutes ago when I started this answer, I said,
I was wondering where you were going with this.
I said, in some respects, it's completely different. But in other respects, it's not, because what they've rediscovered is the stability that City have always had. And the control of matches is back. And let's be honest, a lot of these games in this winning run, they've not been classics. The Everton game was terrible. The Wolves game on Friday night was
Wolves could have scored several times.
They could have, yeah. And like not like the Everton game and the Wolves game, it just a lot of like basic kind of mistakes. It just wasn't good football, but it was solid. It was competent because even there were periods in like November when City would play well, but they'd just get overrun in the second half. Like they played really well against Sporting Lisbon, lost 4-1. Really well against Brighton in the first half, got overrun completely. They just couldn't keep it up. So now they've kind of got that stability back, and it's thanks to this latest kind of Guardiola formation of high fullbacks, everyone in the middle, and basically the old guys, like the old guys that people thought were finished and need to move on. And yeah, that's why it's not all about the January signings. It's not about the money spent. It's about loads of other things. And look, it's a stopgap. But just to finish off this massively long answer, he's found a way to win. There's no Rodri, obviously. Haaland's been out. He got injured in that Bournemouth game in the Cup. Stones has been out for ages. You know, Akanji's just coming back now. Ake's still out. Loads of centre-backs. Most important midfielder. Most important striker. Foden's been on the periphery as well. He's found that way to win that everybody was kind of saying, you should come up with a solution, way back in the winter. Maybe it's taken too long, but this is what he's come up with now. And yeah, they might finish second. They might win the FA Cup.
Yeah, where do you see it, Phil?
Well, that game at Wembley was almost like the perfect example of what City have become this season, because certainly in the first half, and I think Forest contributed to this by freezing slightly and really, really struggling to get into the game. But it felt as if you could have been there watching City from just about any of Guardiola's seasons. They were so comfortable and so on top and had it really well managed. And there was something really pragmatic about the way they were playing, but they were matching that up with with some proper creativity in the middle. And they looked like they had that game on toast. But then in the second half, it got ragged and it got a bit out of hand, and Forest hit the bar of the post 2 or 3 times. And it became the sort of game that could easily have run away from them. And that seems to have been how it's been for Guardiola for a lot of this season. So yeah, like tactically, he's done quite well actually to pull it round and to get them to this point where it looks like they will finish top 5. But I don't know. I mean, I sort of feel like the biggest thing he'll learn from this season, this sounds really strange to say because I've always thought of it as a big Guardiola strength, is probably reading the room and knowing when a player is given as much as they can give. And, going back historically with Guardiola, he's usually pretty ruthless when it comes to replacing big names, either for reasons that he can't manage them anymore or that he just doesn't feel like they're contributing in the way that he needs them to. And he doesn't often get blindsided, But if you take De Bruyne and Kyle Walker as 2 examples of massive personalities, massive influences under Guardiola, they have been allowed to go on a little bit too long. It kind of feels to me like De Bruyne in particular still has a bit of lead in his pencil, but I do understand why City are saying enough's enough. I don't think squad size has particularly been the issue. I think injuries have been a problem, and it's very hard to moan about squad size when you've got in recent memory the treble year when the resources that Guardiola had and he built what so well for him. I just think his faith in certain individuals is probably extended a little bit too far. But in fairness, that's quite an easy mistake to make, I reckon, when you rate some of these players as highly as he must do.
Yeah, one thing he has had faith in to a certain degree over the years is bringing young players through. Some in particular, Phil Foden, we can say, Lewis, we can say, but Nick O'Reilly at the moment, Sam, is really interesting for me, and James McAtee as well have stood out most recently. O'Reilly's fascinating because of the goals he's scoring. Now, a couple of weeks ago, I was just doing a little deep dive on YouTube, and I'm trying to watch him in the youth system and see where he's been playing. So he's primarily playing as a fullback, but this is a kid that was also played as a number 9. He's a kid that's played as a number 8 and as a number 10. This is a really interesting progression for a youth player. But then actually you look at Rico Lewis, you look at Oscar Bob, you look at what they're able to do around the field. This is yet another product of an interesting youth system that City seem to be producing.
Oh, the City Academy produces great players, and they know the system. So in terms of like Vitor Hayes coming in, it's like I never expected him to play because of his physical stature. But it's like, and he's not played either, Jemai Simpson-Poussey, but he was a centre-back he played earlier in the season. But it was like, well, if it was between those two, you'd have to go with Jemai because he knows how City want to play because it's what the academy do. And like the coaching is all geared towards not just the tactics of the first team, but receiving the ball in the same way that you need to do in the first team, using the ball in spaces, appreciating the spaces in the same way. It's all geared towards that. But yeah, with O'Reilly, he's an attacking midfielder. When I went to Everton recently, I was sat next to Paddy Boyland, our Everton guy, and he was like, "Oh, I was like, how's he been?" I was like, "He's good." I was like, "He doesn't really look out of place, even though he's playing out of position." He goes, "What is he, a centre back?" I was like, "No, he's an attacking midfielder." But he's 6'4".
Yeah.
But he doesn't play like it. He plays very, very nimble. He plays like Rico Lewis, basically. Small spaces, pockets of space, get the ball, turn. He's very creative as well. In that sense, he's more creative than Rico Lewis. But in terms of how he uses the ball, he's very similar. Guardiola wants him to play as a holding midfielder because he's tall. He's like, well, as much as Guardiola's kind of an innovator, he's still kind of classic in that sense. He's like, you're tall, mate. Start winning headers back there.
Yeah.
He looks like, because of his height, he should be massively awkward. That was my impression of him at Wembley. That he should be kind of a bit out of water, but actually he's got loads of finesse and really good balance. I have to say as well, I mean, on the day in particular, Rico Lewis in those pockets looked fab. Nightmare to pick up and really did pull the strings. And as I said previously, I don't know how much of that was down to Forrest not waking up for a good 45 minutes, but there's some rare old talent there. There definitely is.
But it's interesting because what you were saying before, Phil, about Pep maybe being loyal to his players for too long, and Ayo, your question about the youngsters, it goes hand in hand, because I think one of the biggest frustration of City fans, and probably some of the players themselves, throughout the season has been, that period in December when there were so many injuries, the performances were so bleak. Like, for what it's worth, I went into a game going, they're going to lose this. There's no way they can win this game. And every week it was Gundogan, Kovacic, Bernardo. And it's like, they can't play again. It's like, well, they can't play against Juventus on Wednesday because they've got United on Sunday. And then if they play then who's going to be fit and fresh? And they just played all the time. And the results and the performances kind of just got worse and worse. And that was the period when people were like, well, why not play McAtee? Especially because all pre-season, Guardiola was like, he's good enough to stay with us. He can play with us. And you think, okay, going into the season, he's probably not going to. I was thinking he's probably not going to play that much unless like everyone gets injured. And then everyone did get injured or was playing really badly. And he still didn't play. And he still really hasn't. In the last few weeks, he's come in a bit more. But I can't imagine it'll be enough to keep him in the summer because his contract's only got a year left on it. And then there's O'Reilly. But again, as recently as December, nobody would have said, I'll bring in O'Reilly at left back. And to be fair, he didn't really need it because Guardiola's been one of the better players this season. Still makes mistakes, but he's been better. He's been one of the most consistently reliable players who's always available. We've not needed a left back. But it's something Guardiola has talked about a couple of times, and recently he just brings it up off his own back. He'll be like, look, maybe I could have played them earlier in the season. I thought it was probably too unstable an environment to throw them into because the team was really that much of a mess. I suppose if you throw like a 19-year-old into it, probably thought they could ruin them just as much as they could kind of turn things around, which I do get. But he's always saying it now because maybe I could have done it sooner, but I didn't feel like now was the time. But at this moment in time, everything's kind of come together, whereas, O'Reilly can be the left back because he just stays high and wide on the left. And he looks very solid defensively as well. But when he's in the final third, you can tell he's an attacking midfielder. I talked about the Everton game. That run he made, if you look at the goal that he scored against Everton, look at his run and Marmoush's run. Marmoush is the forward. He made a better run than Marmoush. That's why he got the goal. Marmoush was kind of surprised when the ball went behind him that O'Reilly was there. So that's what he can bring as well.
Phil, I'm just thinking about all this stuff when we're talking about could Guardiola have done it sooner. I mean, this is, by his standards, an unprecedented season for Guardiola. And I mean, sometimes you just look at it and think he's only human, and perhaps just for the stability of it all, you just stick with your usual lieutenants and hope that at some point it all fits together.
Yeah, there are definitely times when you have to batten down the hatches, and I've seen it before as well. When I guess the virtue of using younger players or academy products starts to become questionable when everybody feels under so much pressure, and you start to worry that you're throwing them into an environment that is going to be detrimental rather than one that's going to let them thrive. I mean, in normal circumstances and in the average season at City, particularly with Guardiola as coach, it's absolutely perfect for any talented kid coming through to cut the teeth because you've got so many players you can learn from round about you. He has a good enough depth of resources where he doesn't have to overuse you if he doesn't want to. But this season's been slightly different. I mean, Sam touched on the injuries, but also the form has meant that it's been a bit of a struggle for certain players to to kind of keep the place in the team. So what do you do with these lads? Like, to what extent do you trust them? And I mean, we've seen in the past a lot of criticism initially, or a lot of questions asked about the way in which Guardiola used Phil Foden when he was younger. I think given to different clubs or different coaches, Foden would have played a lot sooner than he did under Guardiola. But when he kind of came of age and started to be a mainstay in the team, you suddenly felt like Guardiola had nailed it, had called it perfectly, and had timed it right with him. And I don't doubt it to some extent that'll be true of some of the others who are coming through. I'm not convinced that having used them earlier in the season would have made any difference to the way this season is going to end for them ultimately. I don't think it would have turned them into serious competitors with Liverpool at the top of the Premier League. I don't think it would have got them much further in the Champions League. They've just been substandard by their own standards this season. But it is a kind of good tier of kids to work with and to build on to some extent. And this season might actually be quite good for them in the long run.
Well, Sam, look, you've written a piece which is essentially breaking down what the club are planning for the summer window. How many incomings can we really expect? We've spoken about, obviously, what's happened in January, and also, from your opinion, which positions look most likely to be the ones where Manchester City spend money on?
Yeah, I think 4 or 5 signings is the plan. And then I think it's looking like, still needs to kind of be finalised from my point of view. I'm sure they know. Left back seems to be one, just in the way that they were looking at Andrea Cambiasso in January, but couldn't get it done. It seems, that's one that could easily be revived. But then ones we know definitely a bit more of, Gibbs-White, Morgan Gibbs-White. I know David Ornstein's mentioned that previously. That's one that, I don't know, I'd be surprised if it didn't happen at this point. And Florian Wirtz, in the article I did last week, that was just more like, there's interest in Florian Wirtz, but I've had more conversations since then, and I don't know. I'd say it's got to the point now where maybe the same as Gibbs-White. It's got to a stage now where if he didn't go to City, which is obviously still possible because until deals are done, they can go anywhere. If he didn't go to City now, I'd probably think, oh, okay, something's changed there, because from what I understand at the moment, City are in quite a good position there. So that you can obviously see.
Is this for Wirtz or Gibbs-White?
For Wirtz, sorry.
Okay,
Gibbs-White is kind of.
What are they talking money-wise then, Sam? I mean, in terms of fees for these two, like what would we be looking at?
It's going to be a lot. I don't know. Yeah. It depends how much. It depends how much Forest. I don't know. I suppose how much. Not in this sense because they'd want to keep Gibbs-White, but how much it would do them a favour financially. If there's a kind of a sell to buy element, we saw with Villa when they made the Champions League, they still had to sell players going into it, which is, a whole other strand of the PSR debate. But if, City are normally a club that like to work with leverage, but also there's a kind of homegrown demand, which we'll get into in terms of their summer plans. And then Wirtz, again, it's not like City are in a really super strong position because, for a start, if Bayern Munich want you, Real Madrid want you, it's not like you have to go cap in hand to City, is it? You can say, okay, well, these guys want me as well, so can you give me a good wage, please? But also, I think there's the understanding that he could leave in a year's time anyway, so there might be a bit of middle ground to find there. But those two are obviously going to be large fees. But the thing is, we talked about the money spent in January. Over the last few years, City haven't spent huge amounts by any means. Part of the reason why they need this rebuild now is because maybe they didn't do it before. And I get why. After the treble win, Mahrez goes, and Gundogan goes. Kyle Walker could have gone. Bernardo could have gone. And it was like, can't lose you two as well. Can you please stay? Obviously, it's got to the period now where you think, well, maybe it would have been best to wave by at the time, but they didn't. They helped stay together. They won another trophy. And then even last summer, Alvarez goes. They bring in Savinho. They get Gundogan back on a free and they go, okay, that'll be fine. And obviously, it's not been fine, but they've not spent that money. And at the same time that they've not been spending huge sums like they might do this summer or they kind of did in January. They've been selling the young kids. As everybody knows, Palmer going, but not just Palmer, like Shea Charles, people like that. Academy kids that we've kind of talked about there, why they're so good, they're then appealing to other teams who go, okay, well it's like the old United Academy graduates when Ferguson was there. It was like, that's a stamp of approval, isn't it? Like, okay, he played for United, he must be good. That's what it's like at City. And also you've got Joe Shields, who went to Southampton and now at Chelsea, and you've got Jason Wilcox, who went to Southampton, now at Man United. Okay, Sancho's on the market. Tosin Adarabioyo's on the market. Anybody who's still at City now that they get Liam Delap, who are his two biggest options in the summer, as far as I know, it's still Chelsea and United. Why? Because the people that were his academy directors and now at other clubs. So City have been able to make loads of money. I think it's about 150 million over the last few years off selling young players, and Alvarez for upwards of 80 million at a time when they've not been spending so much. So that, are they going to spend loads of money this summer? Yeah, possibly. And in terms of Phil saying earlier on, different accounting periods. What is it, after January 30th? You start a new accounting period. The money they got from Alvarez and I think Cancelo last summer because he finally left.
Cancelo.
That's in kind of the current accounting periods. That's like 100 million. That's in the same accounting period as the 183 million from the guys in January. So then you roll that over into the next one. It all kind of balances out because of City's kind of their own PSR headroom is compared to most clubs absolutely massive, and it's because they haven't spent an awful lot as much as people would think they have, and they've been bringing in quite a lot.
It's the tricky thing with the rebuild is that if you want to increase your competitive level in the really short term, i.e. if City want to be considerably better next season, then while they're always going to buy future prospects and invest in the sort of medium to longer term, because that's what City do and what they've always done, you do need to try and add a couple of big hitters if you can in amongst them. But the problem these days is that big hitters are so expensive. So once you go after somebody like Gibbs-White, who's at another Premier League club and who anybody would take, you're talking really big money. And likewise with Wirtz in Germany. I mean, his stock is just about as high as you can get, particularly at a club in Germany that isn't Bayern Munich. I suppose that one thing that might help, and Sam would be better placed to answer this than me, is that in losing De Bruyne, they're going to lose a huge wage. I mean, I read one of your pieces last week which said that he was on a wage that's in the region of £400,000 a week. Is that right?
Yeah, about 20 million a season or so, isn't it?
I mean, that now don't get me wrong, that doesn't necessarily instantly help with transfer fees, but in a lot of, you can amortise transfer fees and spread them out over longer accounting periods and the length of a player's contract. So for the purposes of how it looks in the PSR calculations and everything else, there are ways and means of kind of cutting corners or not fiddling the books, but working the numbers to your favour. But with wages have to be paid, and you would think that De Bruyne leaving opens up some pretty good avenues to employ highly paid players who won't expect as much and won't be paid as much, but can still be paid a hefty salary that will tempt them through the door.
Well, yeah, this was part of the article last week. They want to trim the wage bill, actually. So, people all of a sudden now City are doing okay again. It's 183 million in January, and it's like, oh well, people are already rolling their eyes if they spend. Let's say they spend 100 million each on Gibbs-White and Florian Wirtz. Yes, that's fairly hefty, you'd have to say. But it's like it's all because of what we just described. Don't need to go into that again. Selling the young players, that kind of thing. But again, in terms of the business sense, they want to cut the wage bill this summer. So I think if you're a City fan hearing that, you're thinking, hold on a minute, we need this big rebuild. De Bruyne is going. How are you trying to save money? How are you trying to cut corners? But I think it's fairly easy to understand, unless you're trying to buy Mbappe or Bellingham from like Real Madrid or like already at the very top, like Lamar possibly. No player, even if they sign Wirtz, and even if Wirtz could use the Bayern interest and the Real Madrid interest, no player is going to be asking for like 400 grand a week that De Bruyne is on.
Yeah, Phil, very quickly on Gibbs-White, you talk about big hitters coming into this club and having to pay a fee for them. From what we've seen of this player, do you think this is a player under this system that Guardiola plays that could actually step up to a player that could play very well in competitions like the Champions League, for instance, because that's the kind of player that City should be looking at if they are to, for this, I guess, rebuild to be relatively successful?
I think he'd be a good fit. Yeah, I do. You're never quite sure with City because it's such a extreme level of excellence, or has been over the years, and I have very fresh in my mind the image of Calvin Phillips going there from Leeds United for I think 43 million as it was a couple of seasons back, and thinking he should do okay there. He should do fine. He'd been very, very good at Leeds, better than very good at Leeds. He'd earned a move up the ladder. That was a huge opportunity for him, and I thought he would do okay. And what you realised was that once Phillips got into City, he just wasn't able to meet the standards that Guardiola was after. And I think beyond that, you realise that what Rodri in particular was doing in that midfield, in the area that Phillips would be wanted to deputise or to fill in when Rodri wasn't there, or take his place if he happened to be better than him, which he wasn't. It was exceptional. Rodri was virtually the best of the best in that role in European football, and that is what you have to be to play under Guardiola. It certainly was in that period where they were going for the treble. So how well Gibbs-White will adjust, or would adjust if he does go, remains to be seen. But he's a really classy footballer, and he's heading for the top bracket. And as far as his sort of personal circumstances go as well, because obviously Forest are not a mile away themselves from qualifying for the Champions League, but I do wonder how wedded he would be to them. He's not from Nottingham. He doesn't support Forest. He's been on the books for 3 years, not an exceptionally long period of time. And he wasn't particularly shy in bailing out of Wolves when the opportunity came, which is not a criticism of him, it's just a fact. So my feeling with him at 25, I often feel like he's younger than that, but he is 25 now, and he won't want to miss the boat if a big offer drops. And let's be honest, City's the sort of transfer that most players jump on when it comes around. And what about him says he'll be any different?
It's really interesting with Gibbs-White, because I feel like the City fan base, as far as I can tell, are really split on it. If not, at least from the algorithm I've got on my Twitter feed, slightly more negative about it. I think people want like Rinders from AC Milan, because obviously you talk about the fee as well for Premier League talent, and he'd be cheaper and things like that. And I think people were a bit underwhelmed by Gibbs-White. Possibly there's a lingering dislike of him because of that clash he had with Rodri a couple of seasons ago when Rodri got sent off for like grabbing him around the throat and all things like that. But I remember seeing him play against City. I think it was like February last year, and ever since, because I always see this, like the transfer chiefs at Premier League teams, like when Liverpool signed Jota, you think, how have you just seen that? And go, we put him into what we've got, and his talent's just going to multiply. And I know Grealish isn't a good example now because of how it's went, but I remember watching back the 2020 Carabao Cup final from 5 years ago when Grealish played for Villa, and you see him floating around the pitch with the ball. And you say, I can see exactly why City wanted that. And I've been trying to look out for that more in recent years. And when I saw Gibbs-White in this one game in particular last year, I just thought, I could see him doing this at City and being better for it. So I think it'd be a good signing. But it is a really interesting one because, he's had a good season, but he's not had the kind of season where he's like a demand. It's not like you've got to go and get this kid. But I personally think what he's got fits into what City need. And again, with the homegrown element, look, if City don't sell too many homegrown players, they're not going to have a problem. But basically, because of the Champions League or UEFA rules, because they might be in the Europa League, but probably Champions League now, you do need to have at least 8 homegrown players. And if you don't fill the 8 spots, you get a spot cut off. So this year they had 23 players in their squad because they had 6 homegrown. So they didn't have the 8, so they cut 2 off. And it's been fine. But if you start messing with that balance too much, it becomes difficult. But next year, Oscar Bob counts as homegrown, so that's going to help. So they could say, afford to get rid of one, and they don't need to replace him because Bob's going to be there. But any more than that, they need to have. If they get rid of 2, they need Bob and somebody else. If they get rid of 3, they need Bob and 2 others. So it's an interesting one in terms of who could go, especially because Guardiola is not thinking about having a bigger squad. He's talking about having more reliable players. Speaking about Grealish, John Stones, Ake, who's homegrown, McAtee, like I said before, with his situation, they could lose a few homegrown players, and in that case, they'll need to bring in replacement for all of them, apart from the one who's going to be Bob. So that's kind of where the Gibbs-White thing comes in as well, and also great mates with Foden. So if there's anything, I think they're doing all they can at City to get Foden back to the Foden that we know that he is. And I'm not saying they'd be signing Gibbs-White specifically because of that, but I'd say it'd probably be a happy little benefit to it as well. So if Gibbs-White does come, there'd definitely be a few boxes he would tick there.
Wirtz is a sexier player to sell, isn't he, to a fan base? Sure. I mean, there is nobody out there who's going to look at Wirtz and think, okay, if you've got the sort of wealth of resources where you already have players like that, and you think, look, it's just an excess signing that, and he might be absolutely world class, but we just have a lot of quality in that position anyway. Then it doesn't, it's not necessarily a good space, good way to spend money, but. If you need someone there, and I think City do, Wirtz is not the sort of player anybody's going to complain about. You'd be absolutely delighted to get him through the door. And I think with De Bruyne going, City do need somebody who unlocks the door in the way that De Bruyne has for so long. It was one of his massive strengths, was just the ability to pick passes and see passes that very few other players would. But alongside that, I do think that they would feel very positive benefit of Gibbs-White energy, and I think they would find him an asset in the midfield. And I'm interested to hear Sam say that they might well do both, just because of the kind of extreme cost of it. But I can see why both would be good for them.
Okay, super quickly, Sam, we've spoken about potential incomings, and the thought of Florian Wirtz in the Premier League already is getting me excited. But, what about outgoings? De Bruyne for sure. Bernardo Silva, that name keeps creeping up. Edison, the keeper. And even you spoke about Nathan Ake as well. Almost a bit player now for City at the moment.
Well, just because of his injury situation. Like, this is the thing with Stones and Grealish and Ake. Nobody doubts their quality. If they're available, like Stones is one of the best centre-backs, like just everything that we've seen in England. So would you keep him for that? Yeah, but always injured, unfortunately. Ake's got fitness problems too. So in that sense, yeah. But, Ake would be one of the key guys if he were available. He just isn't. Edison, it feels like time to move on, not because City have outgrown him. It's like the old rip the Band-Aid off thing after the treble, or like last summer. It's like, in hindsight, could you have got rid of Edison and started this rebuild soon? Yeah, maybe, but it's like he's so good. And I feel like whoever they're going to get in is going to be a step down. You've just got to do it a different way, a step down in terms of his distribution. But he wanted to go last summer. City said, okay, well, 50 million. And like Saudi Arabian teams, they don't generally pay high fees. They pay high wages, but they don't pay high fees. And nobody was willing to pay it. But, they've had another year to kind of work on that as people. And I think the family are ready for a move away from Manchester. I think ideally he'd go to Europe. But if not, then Saudi's fine. So, yeah, that's going to be a big one. Bernardo Silva, personally, again, City fans don't just think, in large part, think it's time to go, but they kind of really turned on him a bit. Mm-hmm. But I think Bernardo, kind of as we've seen recently, you put him in a team that is working, is stable, is functional, and you don't have the problems with the fitness. You don't have to be chasing back 50 metres and being caught looking slow, because you're already in the right place. That's why City have been so good. Nobody gets caught out and has to run back 50 metres. But once the system doesn't work, you're all doing it. I think, as we've seen at the end of this season, get the stability back. Bernardo's got plenty to offer. And like Kovacic, for example. Kovacic has been great recently. It's exactly the same thing. So all of a sudden, you could look at the squad as we would have in December and go, I don't like the look of that, don't like the look of that, don't like the look of that. He's not.
That's a good point.
But you look at it in the summer and go, actually, yeah, Bernardo, I could see that, that's fine. Gundogan is another one. Gundogan's been playing well recently.
Yeah.
And so has Kovacic. So you add in a couple of star names there, and I think the midfield looks better than it would have done 3 or 4 months ago.
How hard is it to find that balance, Phil, though, in terms of, we've spoken about big players potentially leaving, and then obviously players coming in, to find that balance of keeping enough in that team that maintains the DNA of the team, so it's not a massive overhaul, so you can still compete at the highest level when you are moving into this new rebuild?
Yeah, I mean, a lot's been written. Sam had done pieces on this, the Manchester City 2.0, 3.0, the way in which Guardiola kind of reframes them and redraws them and makes them either markedly different or slightly different to what he had previously. And he has gone through big names, big players at City. He's moved on from people like Aguero and David Silva and others. And it has to happen. Ideally, you want to be able to replace like for like in terms of temperament and experience. But it's not always easy to get.
Timing, who's on the market, all that stuff, right?
And title winning experience, whether it's Premier League or major European division or the Champions League, is uber expensive. But if you have the money to do Florian Wirtz, for example, then you're bringing in a bit of that, because he's coming from a club whose Bundesliga title last season was so impressive and completely nerveless, and he was, a massive part of that key component in the team.
Okay, let's finish on this, gents, because Manchester City are 3 points behind Arsenal now, in third in the Premier League. So potentially carrying on this form, it looks like Champions League football is imminent for them next season. How big of an achievement is it to secure this, Sam? We'll start with you on this one. I was listening to Guardiola post-match after the Everton game, and I think it was Natalie Garda, who we've had on Gedros, or I should say, who we've had on the podcast, was asking him how big is the Champions League, and he said, you know what, from 9 years when I entered this country, and getting to the Champions League in this league, in this country, it's absolutely massive. So he still feels it. But for a team like Manchester City, considering the season they've had, is Champions League a successful season? Champions League qualification a successful season for them? And let's not forget the FA Cup as well, to be fair.
Well, it's one of those. Well, yeah, it's one of those things where Guardiola always said, but City would be trying to win the title or like the treble or the Champions League as well. He'd go, look, today we qualify for the Champions League, and we're just like not noticed because it'd be the middle of April. They had bigger fish to fry because we just qualify for the Champions League. That's always the main target. And everyone thinks he's taking a piss. But like he always genuinely means it. But the question of, is it an achievement or is it a successful season? It depends, doesn't it? Because you go back to like December, January, and you think, I don't know when they're next going to win a match. But I remember we did podcast then, and I'm not sure what they're going to do, but I think they'll get top 4. It'll be all right. But again, it took until the very end of March for things to click, for this run of form to come together. But basically, I think if you go back to the start of the season, say, finish second and win the FA Cup, you'll be like, oh, what's gone on there? Like, that doesn't sound that good. But as long as they're in the title race, maybe. But you look at it in December and go, well, you finish second from this, and you'll win the FA Cup from this. Because, yeah, the way the season was going, I don't say easily, but it could have quite possibly carried on being bad.
All right, let's end it there, gent. Sam, Phil, thanks so much for your time. And also thank you guys for watching as well. Don't forget to like the video and also subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Leave us a cheeky comment as well. That's it from us. We'll be back soon. If you want to watch more episodes of the show, please subscribe to the channel. We'll be joined by the likes of David Ornstein, Matt Slater, Adam Crafton, Carl Anker, and plenty more through the season. If you'd like to listen to the episodes in full in audio form, search The Athletic FC wherever you get your podcast from.